Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. This story will leave you speechless. It was supposed to be a perfect evening, until two corrupt cops decided to cross the line. In an act of sheer arrogance, they tore Mike Tyson's wife's expensive dress, laughing as if it were a joke. But what they didn't realize was that they had just provoked one of the most dangerous men on the planet. With fury in his eyes and justice in his fists, Mike Tyson stepped forward, ready to teach them a lesson they would never forget. In the heart of Los Angeles, where the city lights painted the streets with gold and the night was alive with the hum of honking cars and distant laughter, a storm was brewing, one that would change everything. The city was alive. Car horns pulsed like a steady heartbeat, blending with the distant hum of music and the lively chatter spilling from upscale restaurants. The golden glow of streetlights bathed the sidewalks, casting long, soft shadows over the restless energy of the night. Then, the restaurant door swung open. A familiar figure stepped out, his very presence shifting the air around him. Confidence, strength, power. It was Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion of the world. Even without a title belt draped over his shoulder, he commanded respect with every step. Beside him, his wife Kesha shimmered like a rare jewel in the urban sea. Her designer dress hugged her figure with effortless elegance, a reflection of the grace and poise she carried so naturally. With their fingers intertwined, the couple soaked in the glow of a perfect evening, completely unaware that trouble was lurking just beyond the lights. Kesha lifted her gaze to Mike, her eyes sparkling as brilliantly as the city skyline. "Mike," you really know how to pick a restaurant. That was incredible. Kesha's eyes sparkled with the joy of a perfect evening, holding the unspoken promise of a night that was only just beginning. A playful flirtation danced in her voice, adding a softness to the moment. Mike, once feared in the ring, respected by millions, let out a low chuckle, his gaze filled with nothing but admiration. "Only the best for my queen," he rumbled, his deep voice resonating like the steady pulse of the city around them. His hand, strong, calloused from years of battle, gently caressed hers, a stark contrast to the power he was known for. A simple gesture, yet filled with meaning. But just beyond their perfect moment, trouble was closing in. Despite the power coiled beneath his frame, Mike Tyson walked with ease, his legendary ferocity tucked beneath a quiet confidence. As he and Kesha approached their gleaming black luxury SUV, the night still felt perfect. Then, out of the shadows, two figures emerged. Their presence alone shifted the energy. Rigid postures, arms crossed, eyes filled with something colder than curiosity. Standing beside their patrol car, clad in the unmistakable blue of the LAPD, were Officers Bradley and Miller. Their sneering whispers cut through the night, their eyes trailing Mike and Kesha with a look drenched in contempt. Even from a distance, it was clear. These men weren't here to serve or protect. They had already chosen their targets. To these officers, Mike Tyson wasn't a man. He was a target. Officer Bradley's lips twisted into a snarl as he muttered under his breath, each word dripping with disdain. "Another rich thug flashing money," he sneered, his voice laced with the kind of cynicism that festers after years of unchecked bias. His eyes narrowed, scanning Mike with a look of pure contempt. His fingers twitched near the baton at his waist, gripping it tightly, like a predator getting ready to strike. To him, the sight of a Mike Tyson, successful, wealthy, unshaken, was a provocation, one that demanded a response. To Officer Miller, Bradley's words weren't just fuel, they were validation. He let out a self-satisfied smirk, his eyes dark with something worse than hatred. "Damn, that dress," he drawled, his tone laced with something vile. His gaze lingered too long, sweeping over Kesha's figure with a hunger that had nothing to do with admiration. "Must have cost more than my whole damn paycheck." His tongue flicked out, wetting his lips as if savoring the moment. Like predators circling their prey, Bradley and Miller moved in unison, every step calculated, their body language a silent assault. They weren't just looking for trouble, they were creating it. With each step they took toward Mike and Kesha, the tension thickened, like a storm gathering strength. Even the night itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of what was about to unfold. Mike, his instincts sharpened by years in the ring, felt the shift before a single word was spoken. His fingers curled around the car door handle, a subconscious display of readiness. His body remained still, but inside, the beast was waking. Officer Bradley, grinning like a man who had already decided how this would play out, spoke first. "Nice car," he purred, his voice slick with false admiration. Then, with a smirk that barely concealed his contempt, he added, "A little too nice for someone like you, don't you think? Too nice for someone like you, don't you think?" The words weren't just an insult. They were a challenge, a deliberate jab at Mike's past, his upbringing, his struggles, his rise from nothing. Bradley's smirk said it all. He wasn't just questioning the car. He was questioning the man who owned it. Most people would have taken the bait. Most people would have snapped. But Mike Tyson wasn't most people. He inhaled deeply, forcing himself to harness the fire raging inside. Years of discipline held him steady, keeping his fury just beneath the surface. Then, in a voice that was almost too calm, too measured, he met Bradley's gaze. "We got a problem here, officer." Each word was laced with restrained venom. A quiet warning, a final chance for Bradley to back down. But some men don't know when to stop. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settled deep into the bones. Then Officer Miller, a man who thrived on manipulation, stepped in, his grin as slimy as the words he was about to speak. "Actually," he began, his voice dripping with fake politeness, the kind that barely hid the venom beneath. "We've had reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description." He let the words hang, savoring the moment, his eyes gleaming with triumph as he delivered the verbal sucker punch. "You wouldn't happen to be driving a stolen car, would you?" It wasn't a question. It was an accusation wrapped in a smirk, designed to provoke. Beside Mike, Kesha felt the shift immediately. Her instincts, honed by a lifetime of knowing exactly how these moments could turn, screamed at her. This wasn't just harassment. It was a trap. The tension in the air was unbearable, a symphony of discordant notes, each one pushing the moment closer to breaking. Keisha felt it. She saw where this was heading. "Let's just go, Mike," she whispered, her fingers gripping his arm, pressing into solid muscle like a desperate plea. "It's not worth it." Her voice, usually soft, confident, now carried something sharper. Fear. And that fear cut deeper than any insult. Mike's jaw tensed, his fury threatening to consume him, but he held the line. His composure wasn't weakness, it was defiance. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself, then met the officers with an even, unshaken tone. "I ain't got nothing to prove." His words weren't just a response, they were a statement. "If you need to check my plates, go ahead." It was cooperation, but it was also a dare, one that put the officers on the defensive. Because deep down, Mike already knew the truth. This wasn't about the car. It was a dare, wrapped in the guise of cooperation, a calculated move, a shift in control. For the first time, Bradley and Miller were forced onto the defensive. But Mike knew the truth. This wasn't a fight he could win, because in this kind of battle, there were no winners, only survivors. Bradley snorted, the sound thick with arrogance. "Oh, we'll check it," he sneered, his smirk widening into a self-satisfied grin. His eyes gleamed with something darker than authority, something personal. Then, his voice dipped, dragging out his next words like a slow, deliberate knife twist. "But first..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. And just like that, the power dynamic had shifted again. Mike had been here before both in the ring and outside of it. He recognized the game they were playing, but this time, it wasn't about titles. It wasn't about pride. It was about something much bigger. Mike had spent a lifetime learning one thing: never underestimate your opponent. Inside the ring, it could cost you a championship. Outside of it, it could cost you much more. Bradley's gaze drifted from Mike's tense frame to Kesha's dress, his eyes dark with something twisted, something more than just hatred. Like a cat stalking a bird, he lingered, circling with the slow, measured gaze of a predator. The intricate stitching, the expensive fabric, the effortless elegance. It spoke of a world beyond his reach, a world he resented with a passion that bordered on obsession. And that resentment slithered into his voice as he finally spoke. His words dripped with contempt, his mocking tone curling around them like poison. Bradley scoffed, his voice laced with pure venom. "This dress," he sneered, his eyes narrowing as he studied the fabric with a look of contempt. "Must have cost a fortune, huh? Bet you love spending that boxing money." Each word was a precision strike, aimed directly at the heart of Mike's pride. A taunt designed to provoke, to strip him down, not physically, but psychologically. Most men would have cracked under the weight of Bradley's bullying. But Mike Tyson wasn't most men. His resolve had been forged in the fire of adversity, tempered by battles far greater than this one. He didn't flinch. He didn't waver. But Bradley wasn't done. Playing the part of a pretentious fashion critic, he reached out, his arrogance dripping from every movement, as his fingers grasped the delicate fabric of Kesha's dress. The moment his hand made contact, the air itself seemed to still. And just like that, he crossed a line. Bradley's fingers toyed with the delicate fabric of Kesha's dress, his touch slow, deliberate, a mockery of admiration. "Beautiful," he mused, his voice thick with false appreciation. His lips twisted into a sneer. "You must feel like a princess in this." But there was no admiration in his eyes. Behind the charade, he reveled in the discomfort flickering across Kesha's face. This wasn't a compliment. It was control. A sick display of power dressed up as casual conversation. But Kesha wasn't the kind of woman to shrink away. Her patience, already worn thin by Bradley's escalating hostility, snapped. She recoiled from his touch as if stung by a scorpion's tail. "Excuse me?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the night like a blade. Her eyes burned with fury as she yanked herself away. "Keep your hands off me!" And just like that, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface ignited. Kesha's words weren't just a reaction. They were a declaration, a claim over her own body, her own dignity. But as the heat of her outrage clashed against Bradley's cold, arrogant smirk, the standoff became something far more dangerous. A game of who would blink first. And that's when Mike moved. In a single, fluid motion, he stepped between Kesha and Bradley, his presence like a steel wall. A living warning of the storm brewing within. His body was taut, coiled like a predator ready to strike. Then came his voice, low, rough, laced with something primal. A growl that carried the weight of his past. The weight of a man who had once ruled the ring with his fists and his fury. A warning, a promise. And Bradley had just crossed the line. Mike's voice cut through the night like a blade. "You're crossing a line, man." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. A final warning. The sheer intensity of his words sent a ripple through the air, forcing even the bravest bystanders to take an uneasy step back. But Officer Miller, emboldened by his partner's antagonism, saw no danger. Or maybe he was too arrogant to recognize it. He slithered up beside Bradley, an ugly smirk splitting his face. "Oh, we're just having some fun, champ," he chuckled, his voice soaked in cruel amusement. The kind of laugh that made your skin crawl. But Mike didn't move. Didn't blink. His eyes locked onto the officers with laser focus, his entire body a controlled force of nature. unshaken, unmoved. But beneath the surface, the storm was coming, and these men had no idea what they had just unleashed. Mike's muscles tensed, his entire body coiled like a caged predator, waiting, watching, for the moment he knew was coming. The fragile thread of civility holding this moment together snapped in an instant. Bradley moved. With a single vicious tug, the delicate fabric of Kesha's dress ripped, the sound sharp, jarring, cutting through the night like a gunshot. The world seemed to stop. For a split second, time itself froze. The moment hung in the air, suspended like shattered glass, glinting in the streetlights. Then, Kesha gasped. Her eyes widened in pure shock and disbelief, her breath catching as she clutched at the ruined remains of her dress. The humiliation, the violation, the sheer audacity. And then, from deep within her chest, a sound rose, one that was no longer just shock, it was rage. And behind her, Mike Tyson's storm had just broken loose. Kesha let out a stifled gasp, her body trembling as the shock gave way to something deeper. Grief. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over in silent rivers of devastation. Her hands, shaking, instinctively clutched the remains of her dress, as if trying to hold on to what had already been taken from her. And then Bradley laughed, cold, cruel, sharp as winter frost. His mockery slashed through the moment, amplifying the shame, the rage, the sheer violation that pulsed through the air like an open wound. "Oops," he sneered, his voice dripping with deliberate cruelty. "Guess it wasn't as strong as I thought." He expected fear. He expected submission. But the words didn't land the way he intended. Instead, they lit a fire. A fire that had been smoldering inside Mike Tyson, one that had now reached its boiling point. The heat of his suppressed fury was no longer just simmering beneath the surface. It was about to explode. The fury that had been simmering inside Mike Tyson finally spilled over. The air around him grew thick, charged with a tension so palpable it felt like electricity, crackling in the space between them. Then came the silence. A deadly calm that descended upon Mike, as foreboding as the dark clouds of a gathering storm. His fists flexed, his jaw tightened. The veins along his forearms pulsed, each beat a silent drum of impending violence. The officers didn't see it yet, but the storm had arrived. And standing in its eye was a man who had once been called the baddest man on the planet. The beast that had ruled the ring now lurked just beneath the surface, hungry, unsatisfied, and waiting. Waiting for just one more push, one more excuse. And when that moment came, there would be no stopping him. The final provocation, the last push that sent everything over the edge. Kesha, who had held her composure through humiliation, through restraint, snapped. Her voice, no longer soft, no longer measured, erupted into a furious roar that ripped through the night like a war cry. "You had no right!" she screamed, her rage exploding in a raw, unfiltered torrent of fury. Her trembling hands clutched the tattered remains of her dress, a cruel reminder of the violation she had just endured. But she wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. Her anger burned with the intensity of a wildfire, consuming every ounce of fear, leaving behind only the unshakable fury of a woman scorned. And as she glared at the men who had dared to humiliate her, her rage became something more than just anger. It became a reckoning. Kesha's rage was a wildfire, burning hot enough to consume anyone who dared to test her. And now, Mike Tyson was done waiting. His body coiled like a serpent, every muscle wound tight, ready to strike. But he didn't lash out. Not yet. Instead, he turned toward the two officers slowly, deliberately, the kind of slowness that spoke of deadly control. His breathing remained steady, measured. But beneath the surface? A storm raged. A fire burned so hot it threatened to shatter the limits of his discipline. The flames of his fury licked at the edges of his restraint, begging to be unleashed. But Mike Tyson wasn't just a fighter. He was a man who had learned to harness the beast inside him. So he held it back. For now. His eyes locked onto the officers, sharp and unblinking, a predator sizing up its prey. And in that moment, one thing became terrifyingly clear. If they pushed him even 1 inch further, there would be no holding back. Mike's eyes locked onto them, like twin barrels of a loaded gun. Waiting. Watching. Ready to fire at the slightest provocation. When he spoke, his voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It came out as a low, gravelly rumble, seeping from his chest like smoke from a volcano's crater, thick with a promise of retribution. You're going to regret that. The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. This wasn't a threat. This was a fact. A chilling declaration of intent, one that sent an unspoken warning through the night. Officer Miller should have listened, but emboldened by arrogance and blinded by his own ignorance, he didn't. Instead, he smirked, and he made the worst mistake of his life. Miller mistook Mike's restraint for hesitation. He saw the calm in his eyes and thought it was weakness. And so, with a smug, overconfident sneer, he pushed further. "Oh yeah?" he taunted, his words dripping with venom. His smirk widened, his voice laced with contempt as he spat out the challenge. "And what are you gonna do about it, champ?" He let the last word fall like a poisoned dart, daring Mike, daring the storm, to cross the invisible line between order and chaos, civility and violence. For a split second, the night stood still. Then, everything exploded. Bradley moved first. With a speed fueled by arrogance, he lunged, his baton slicing through the air, aimed straight at Mike Tyson. A mistake. A fatal miscalculation. Because the moment Bradley moved, Mike was already ahead of him. The baton whipped through the air, a vicious arc of steel and hate, aimed straight for Mike Tyson. But Mike was already gone. Decades of training, a lifetime of battle. His reflexes, sharpened to perfection, took over, his body moving with a speed that defied human reaction time. Like a panther springing from the shadows, he slipped past the strike, his movement so fluid it seemed almost effortless. Bradley never saw it coming. His baton swung through empty air, momentum pulling him forward just as Mike shifted, his presence now looming in a position of dominance. Bradley staggered backward, his breath hitching, like a fish caught on a line. The shock hit him first. "What the hell?" he gasped, his voice rasping with a mix of pain and disbelief. The smugness that had once twisted his face was gone. In its place, horrified recognition. He had made a mistake, and now he was standing in front of a man who never let mistakes go unpunished. Bradley clutched his ribs, his breath ragged, his body struggling to stay upright. But the pain was nothing compared to the cold realization sinking in. He had underestimated Mike Tyson, and now the retired champion loomed over him like a reckoning long overdue. Bradley wasn't in control anymore, and that terrified him. Miller saw it too. Panic flickered in his eyes as he watched his partner stumble. A man who had walked in with arrogance now reduced to a gasping wreck. Desperation took over. He fumbled for his baton, yanking it free as he charged forward. "You want to go, Tyson?" he snarled, gripping the weapon like it could somehow shift the odds in his favor. His bravado was loud, but the fear underneath it was louder. "Let's go!" With a wild cry, his anger collided with terror, his body surging forward as he swung, a desperate attempt to bring down the towering figure standing before him. But Miller had made the same mistake Bradley had. He forgot who he was dealing with. In that moment, Mike Tyson was no longer just a man. He was a force of nature, a storm in human form, unstoppable, undeniable. Miller's baton whipped through the air, a weapon meant to intimidate, to dominate. But it never landed. With primal speed, Mike's hand shot out, intercepting the attack mid-swing. His grip locked around the baton like an iron vise, stopping it dead in its tracks. The sheer force of the impact wrenched Miller's arm back, nearly dislocating his shoulder. But that was nothing compared to what came next. With one brutal motion, Mike ripped the weapon from Miller's grasp, his muscles flexing with raw, effortless power. Then, crack. The baton snapped in two like a twig between his fingers, the sound splitting the air, final and unforgiving. The shattered pieces clattered to the ground, useless. And so was the last shred of Miller's confidence. The shattered pieces of the baton hit the pavement like fallen stars. And with them, the last remnants of Miller's bravado crumbled. The air around Mike Tyson crackled with energy, an invisible storm fueled by the rage that had been held back for far too long. His presence was overwhelming, a force that could no longer be ignored. Then, in a voice cold as an Arctic night, he spoke. "That all you got?" His words were drenched in disdain, his tone mocking, unshaken. His obsidian-sharp gaze cut through Miller, a silent challenge that hung heavy in the stillness. Miller felt the weight of it. And in his desperation, his pride screaming for some kind of redemption, he lashed out. A punch. Wild. Uncontrolled. It was pure fury, not strategy. A mistake. Because Mike had already seen it coming. Mike didn't flinch. Years of experience told him exactly where to be, exactly what to do. As Miller's wild punch came swinging in, Mike was already gone. He slid effortlessly out of the way, ducking under the sloppy strike with a fluid grace that made Miller look like an amateur. And then, Mike struck. With lightning speed and surgical precision, his fist rocketed upward. A perfect uppercut. Crack. Miller's head snapped back, his mouth twisting into a ragged O of shock. Blood spurted from his nose, spraying into the night air as his body collapsed onto the pavement, limp and dazed. He didn't even have time to scream. Bradley watched it all. His chest heaved with panicked, agonized breaths as reality set in. His partner was down, and now, it was just him and Mike Tyson. Shaking, he lurched toward the patrol car, his trembling hands reaching, desperately, for the radio. But Mike wasn't done yet. Pain and adrenaline surged through Bradley's body as he scrambled for the radio, his fingers clawing at empty air. He needed backup, now. But the patrol car, his last chance at safety, felt impossibly far away. Every step was a struggle, like pushing against the howling wind of Mike Tyson's fury. The promise of escape dangled before him, a cruel mirage, always just out of reach. Then, from behind him, a voice. Low, cold, unstoppable, a whisper that sliced through the night like a serrated blade. "Oh, you ain't calling nobody." Mike Tyson was already there. His words carried a finality so absolute, it felt etched into reality itself. Bradley froze. Because deep down, he knew. This was over. The night itself seemed to tighten around them, the air thick with an unspoken certainty. This wasn't a fight. This was a hunt. And Bradley, shaking, breathless, was the prey. Mike Tyson moved. One heartbeat, he was behind him. The next, his fist was locked around Bradley's collar like a steel vice. With terrifying ease, he lifted the officer off the ground, his raw strength on full display. Effortless. Absolute. Bradley's eyes widened in pure, abject terror as his feet left the pavement. He was suspended in midair, completely at the mercy of a man once known as the baddest man on the planet. And in that moment, he realized there was no mercy coming. Mike Tyson wasn't just the baddest man on the planet. In this moment, he was something even more terrifying. His presence was a storm, rolling in with unstoppable force, dark and unrelenting. And then, he spoke. Through gritted teeth, his voice rumbled like distant thunder, a low growl that seemed to rise from the very depths of his soul. "Apologize to my wife." The words weren't a request. They were a sentence. Mike's grip tightened, his fingers digging into Bradley's collar, the fabric stretching, straining, ready to tear. The command hung heavy in the air, electric with an unspoken promise. A wrong that needed to be righted. an insult that demanded correction. Bradley gasped. His breath came in short, panicked bursts, his chest rising and falling in terror, because he finally understood. This wasn't just about a ripped dress. This was about respect. And Mike Tyson wasn't going to ask twice. Bradley gasped, choking on his own fear. His voice, weak, trembling, hollow, finally spilled out the words he should have said long ago. I'm sorry, he wheezed, his breath ragged with desperation. His eyes locked onto Mike's, wide and pleading, silently begging for mercy. I swear, I didn't mean to. But even as the words left his lips, he knew. It didn't matter. The damage was done. The insult had been made. And now, dangling in the iron grip of Mike Tyson, he was powerless to do anything but beg. Mike's expression never wavered. His face, a perfect study in controlled rage, remained unreadable, his fury held in check by nothing more than his own discipline. Then, with deliberate slowness, he lowered Bradley slightly, just enough to let him taste what it was like to be helpless, to feel, for the first time, the fear he had once inflicted on others. And then, with terrifying certainty, Bradley realized, this wasn't over yet. For a fleeting second, Bradley felt the illusion of mercy. Then, Mike's grip tightened, ferocious, unrelenting. His knuckles turned white against Bradley's collar, the fabric straining under the sheer force of his grip. Then came the hiss, low, sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Mean to what? Each word was a hammer, driving Bradley further into his own terror. Disrespect my wife? Rip her dress? Laugh about it? The moment coiled tighter, balanced on the razor's edge of violence and vengeance. The world held its breath. And Mike waited. His eyes narrowed, locked onto Bradley, demanding an answer. But Bradley, panicked, breathless, trapped in the iron grip of his own mistakes, had none. His eyes darted wildly, his flushed face desperate, searching for an escape that didn't exist. His lips quivered, his body shook. And with a frantic, pathetic nod, he surrendered. Bradley nodded frantically, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. It was pure surrender. A desperate attempt to say anything, do anything to escape the wrath closing in around him. Yes! Yes! He choked, the words squeaking from his throat, as if they had been wrung from him by force. I'm sorry! I'm so sorry! I swear I'll never do it again! His voice cracked under the weight of terror, and just like that, Mike let go. His grip, once unyielding as steel, vanished in an instant. Bradley dropped like a stone, tumbling to the pavement, landing with a yelp of pain. His hands shot up to his throat, fingers gingerly pressing against the bruised, aching flesh, as if checking to make sure he could still breathe. But there was no time to recover. With desperation overriding pain, he scrambled toward Miller, hauling his barely conscious partner to his feet. They had come here thinking they were in control. Now, all they wanted was to escape. Miller was barely standing, still reeling from the force of Mike's devastating uppercut. His legs buckled beneath him, his body leaning heavily on Bradley for support. Together, the two officers stumbled toward their patrol car, their movements clumsy, desperate. Their tails tucked firmly between their legs. The engine sputtered to life, the tires screeching against the pavement as they scrambled to flee the scene of their own humiliation. But Mike wasn't done. He stalked toward the car, his body still a coiled spring of barely controlled violence. Then, as Bradley fumbled to shift into drive, Mike leaned in. His shadow fell over them, swallowing them in its presence. Then, with a voice as cold as death itself, he spoke. Mike leaned in closer, his breath hot against Bradley's face. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through steel, he growled, "Next time, you show some respect." The words sliced through the chaos of the night, embedding themselves into Bradley's very bones. There would be no comeback, no smart remarks, no arrogance left to hide behind. The officers, their pride in tatters, their confidence shattered, scrambled into the false safety of their patrol car. Slam. The doors shut behind them with a deafening finality. The vehicle lurched forward, tires squealing against the pavement as they sped off, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the former champion who had just shown them the true meaning of fear. Their faces, twisted in a mixture of pain, humiliation, and something deeper, something they never expected to feel. Pure terror. The humiliation on their faces said it all. They had learned a lesson that night, one they would never forget. Never underestimate the strength of a man's resolve, and never underestimate the fury of his love. As the last echoes of screeching tires faded into the night, Kesha stood in the aftermath. Her composure, still fragile, still shaken, held together by the sheer weight of what had just unfolded. Her fingers traced the jagged edges of the ruined fabric, the dress she had once cherished now nothing more than torn silk and bad memories. "That was my favorite dress, Mike," she whispered, her voice laced with resignation and quiet sorrow. Despite everything, despite the way her husband had stood for her, fought for her, defended her honor, she couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. Because even in victory, there is always something left behind. Kesha felt a twinge of loss, a bittersweet ache in her chest. A reminder that even in victory, there is always sacrifice. For a moment, she stared at the torn fabric, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. Then, Mike's expression softened. The icy intensity that had fueled the confrontation melted away, replaced by something warmer, deeper. He reached out and took her hand, the very same hand that had clung to the ruined dress just moments before. "Don't worry, baby," he murmured, his voice now rich with tenderness. A smile, gentle, reassuring, unshaken, played across his lips. "I'll buy you 10 more. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Hell, 20. Kesha exhaled, a small smile breaking through the weight of the night. As their sleek SUV pulled away, carrying with it the last remnants of adrenaline and fury, one thing was clear. Tonight had been a battle, but love had already won. The night no longer smelled of violence or vengeance. Now, there was only love. Keisha nestled into Mike's side, her fingers resting against the solid muscle of his chest. Beneath her touch, she felt it, the steady thrum of his heart, a rhythm as strong, unbreakable, and constant as the man himself. A man who would go to any lengths to keep her safe. A man who had just defended her honor, not just with his fists, but with his very presence. As their SUV glided into the LA night, the city lights flickering past like echoes of the past, the ghosts of the evening faded, burned away by something greater than anger, stronger than vengeance. Because in the end, they both knew. Their bond was stronger than any single dress, stronger than any moment of adversity, stronger than anything the world could throw at them.